We begin with breaking developments from Eastern Europe, a moment that could mark one of the most dramatic turns in the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Ukraine has struck deep inside the Russian capital, Moscow itself, with precision drone attacks targeting key military and logistical hubs. Explosions lit up the night sky, shaking the very sense of security that Vladimir Putin has long projected to his people. Russian state media tried to downplay the damage, but videos from civilians tell a very different story, one of panic, chaos, and disbelief that the war has, quite literally, come home. Moscow woke up to a sound it had long believed was impossible, the thunderous echo of explosions reverberating across its skyline. What many Russians once saw as the distant noise of war has now become an unsettling reality right at their doorstep. Ukrainian drones flying low and fast pierced through what was once considered one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world. This wasn't just another strike in a war that's dragged on for years. It was a statement, a bold message from Kyiv that no fortress is untouchable, not even the heart of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The attack came under the cover of night. When the city was quiet, its residents lulled into a sense of routine safety. Then, without warning, sirens wailed across several districts, windows shook, and flashes of orange light illuminated the Moscow skyline. Videos began surfacing almost immediately on Russian social media platforms, bright streaks in the sky, followed by loud booms that sent shockwaves through the capital. Within minutes, speculation turned into panic. Could this really be happening inside Moscow? Could Ukraine have reached this far? Eyewitness accounts painted a picture of confusion and disbelief. Some residents described seeing fragments raining down near residential areas. Others claimed to have watched Russian air defenses firing frantically into the night. Traffic halted, alarms blared, and an eerie silence followed each explosion, the kind of silence that only comes when a nation suddenly realizes it is no longer immune. For years, Russian propaganda portrayed Moscow as a fortress, untouchable, shielded, protected by layers of modern technology and military might. But tonight shattered that illusion. Military experts quickly weighed in, calling the incident one of Ukraine's most daring operations. Yet, this is not just a tactical success, one defense analyst said on international television. It's a psychological one. It sends a message to the Kremlin that nowhere is safe, not even the capital. The strategic importance of this moment cannot be overstated. Ukraine's ability to carry out long-range strikes deep inside Russia demonstrates not only growing technical capability, but also a shift in the war's momentum. What was once a defensive struggle for survival is increasingly becoming a counter-offensive designed to expose and exploit Russia's vulnerabilities. Russian state media scrambled to contain the narrative. Within hours, officials released statements claiming the attacks were unsuccessful, that all drones were intercepted, and that no damage had occurred. But the visual evidence told another story. Smoke rising from the outskirts, emergency vehicles racing through the streets, and residents capturing scenes the government wished they hadn't. It was a propaganda nightmare for the Kremlin. The very idea that Ukrainian drones could breach Moscow's airspace, even momentarily, undermined one of Putin's core promises, that ordinary Russians would never feel the war inside their own borders. What makes the strike even more significant is its timing. It comes amid reports of growing unrest within Russia, economic strain from sanctions, and mounting casualties on the front lines. For many in the international community, this incident symbolizes the beginning of a new chapter, one where the balance of fear begins to shift. The hunter has, in some ways, become the hunted. For Ukrainians, this is a powerful morale boost, proof that persistence and ingenuity can break through even the strongest defenses. Technologically, these attacks showcase Ukraine's increasing sophistication. Using modified drones with extended range and precision targeting, Ukrainian forces have achieved something that many military analysts once thought improbable. This kind of operation requires not only technical skill, but also precise intelligence, timing, and coordination. Each successful strike chips away at Russia's sense of invulnerability, and that psychological erosion may prove just as damaging as any physical destruction. Inside Moscow, the mood was described as tense. The government urged calm, but whispers spread quickly through the population. People wanted to know how such an attack could happen, whether more might follow. Telegram channels lit up with speculation, theories, and fear. Some citizens, long supportive of the war, began to question the government's narrative. If they can hit Moscow, one user wrote, then what else have we been lied to about? That single comment captured what might be the most profound impact of the strike. Not the explosions themselves, but the cracks forming in the foundation of Russian confidence. Internationally, the strike sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. In Western capitals, officials viewed it as a sign that Ukraine is growing more assertive, more capable, and more determined to take the fight beyond its own borders. Analysts noted that this could reshape the global perception of the war, from one of victimhood to one of defiance. Meanwhile, in Russia's neighboring states, governments quietly increased their own security alerts, aware that instability in Moscow could spill outward in unpredictable ways. As dawn broke over the Russian capital, smoke still lingered in the air. Authorities tried to clean up the debris and restore normalcy. But the psychological damage had already been done. The image of Moscow as an untouchable fortress was gone, replaced by the unsettling truth that even the most powerful regimes are not beyond reach. For Ukrainians watching from afar, the message was clear: their resistance was no longer confined to defense. It was evolving into a campaign that could strike at the very center of their aggressor's power. In a war defined by symbols, this was one of the most powerful yet. It wasn't just about the physical damage caused, it was about the message it carried. The illusion of safety inside Russia's capital has been pierced, and that perhaps more than anything could change the course of this conflict. For years, Moscow's air defense network was portrayed as one of the most sophisticated and impenetrable in the world, a web of radar systems, anti-missile batteries, and fighter jets designed to detect and destroy any incoming threat before it could come close to the city. Yet, in one extraordinary night, that image was shattered. Ukrainian drones, small and elusive, managed to slip through this so-called Iron Dome and strike at the very heart of Russia's capital. It was a moment that exposed a chilling vulnerability. The mighty Russian air defense system, long considered untouchable, had failed when it mattered most. What unfolded over Moscow was more than just a military lapse. It was a direct challenge to Russia's claims of technological superiority. Residents described seeing streaks of light across the sky, Russian surface, to air missiles firing desperately in every direction. Some intercepted their targets, but others didn't. Explosions rocked the outskirts of the city, followed by plumes of smoke rising over areas that were supposed to be protected by multiple layers of defense. The once reassuring hum of air defense systems now became a haunting reminder that even the most advanced machinery can falter under pressure. In the hours following the attack, Russian officials scrambled to control the narrative. State media outlets immediately announced that all enemy drones were neutralized, a phrase now repeated so often that it has become almost meaningless. But videos from the ground told a different story: glowing fireballs, sirens wailing, and emergency vehicles rushing through Moscow's empty streets. The discrepancy between what the government claimed and what citizens witnessed created an uncomfortable silence, one filled with questions that no one at the Kremlin seemed ready to answer. Experts were quick to point out that this was not an isolated technical glitch. It was in fact the latest in a series of embarrassing failures by Russia's air defense systems across various regions. From Belgrade to Bryansk, similar incidents had been reported in recent months, but none carried the symbolic weight of a breach over Moscow. This is a systemic issue, one Western defense analyst explained. Russia's air defenses are designed for traditional warfare: large targets, predictable flight paths, conventional missiles. These new generation Ukrainian drones exploit every blind spot, moving under radar, swarming, confusing the system until something breaks. The irony is that Moscow's defense network was once considered the crown jewel of Russia's military power. Billions were spent developing and modernizing it. The S-400 missile system, often touted as one of the most advanced in the world, was meant to guarantee the capital's safety against any aerial intrusion. But when tested by a few dozen drones built with a fraction of that budget, it faltered. That failure is not just technical, it's symbolic, a blow to Russia's reputation and Putin's personal narrative of control and dominance. Inside the military command centers, chaos reported unfolded as radar screens lit up with multiple unidentified signals. Commanders struggled to differentiate between decoys and real threats, a tactic that Ukraine has been perfecting for months. It's a form of modern electronic warfare, confusing the enemy's detection systems, forcing them to waste expensive missiles on cheap targets, and overwhelming their ability to respond effectively. The fact that some drones still slip through indicates a significant breakdown in communication and readiness within Russia's defensive structure. Perhaps the most striking part of the incident was the psychological effect it had on both sides. For Moscow's citizens, the myth of their city's invincibility was broken. They watched the night sky, once serene and distant, suddenly filled with danger. For Ukrainians, it was a moment of vindication, proof that Russia's supposed technological superiority could be pierced by ingenuity, persistence, and adaptability. The symbolism of Ukrainian drones reaching Moscow cannot be overstated. It was as if the battlefield had shifted from the trenches of Donbass to the rooftops of Russia's own capital. Military analysts describe this as a turning point in modern warfare, where cheap, accessible technology can undermine even the most expensive defense systems. Drones costing thousands are defeating missile batteries worth millions. It's asymmetrical warfare at its finest, and it's forcing powerful nations to rethink how they defend themselves. Air superiority is no longer about who has the biggest guns, another expert remarked. It's about who has the smartest systems, and right now, Russia's systems are proving not as smart as advertised. In the aftermath, Russian officials promised to strengthen their defenses, announcing new security measures around Moscow and increased air patrols. But such reassurances rang hollow to many. People had seen the explosions, heard the sirens, and felt the tremors themselves. No amount of televised statements could erase the memory of that night or the creeping realization that their city was vulnerable. Even loyalists who once dismissed Ukraine's capabilities began to question how this breach was possible. In a country where criticism of the government can be dangerous, social media became the outlet for silent discontent. If Moscow isn't safe, one post read, then no one in Russia truly is. Internationally, the strike and the subsequent defense failure reverberated through intelligence communities and military think tanks. Western observers took careful note of how Russian systems responded or failed to respond to the incursion. Every radar signal, every delayed interception, every misfired missile offered insight into the weaknesses of what was once considered one of the world's most formidable defense networks. Ukraine's ability to expose those flaws was not just a tactical success, it was an intelligence victory. The broader implication is that Russia's air defenses, while powerful on paper, may not be optimized for kind of decentralized, unpredictable warfare that defines the 21st century. They were built to counter large-scale attacks from NATO, not waves of small, low-flying drones guided by GPS and adaptive algorithms. This mismatch has now become glaringly evident, and correcting it will take time Russia may not have as Ukraine continues to refine its strategy. As night gave way to dawn, the streets of Moscow were littered with fragments of intercepted drones, small reminders of how fragile even the most powerful defenses can be. The Kremlin can rebuild radar stations, reposition missile batteries, and issue new threats, but it cannot rebuild the sense of invulnerability that was lost that night. The sky over Moscow, once seen as an iron shield, now feels open, exposed, uncertain, and haunted by the realization that control, no matter how absolute it seems, can vanish in an instant. For years, Vladimir Putin has carefully cultivated the image of a leader in total command, a man who controls not only Russia's vast territory, but also the narrative that surrounds it. His power has always depended on one core perception, that he is untouchable. But in one shocking night, that illusion began to crumble. As Ukrainian drones tore through Moscow's skies, the world witnessed something the Kremlin had fought desperately to prevent: the appearance of weakness. It wasn't just the breach of airspace that sent tremors through Russia, it was the shattering of the myth that Putin's control is absolute. Inside the Kremlin walls, power has always been about perception. Putin's rise and continued dominance rely on projecting strength, the idea that no threat can challenge him, no enemy can reach him, and no system under his rule can fail. Yet as smoke rose over Moscow, even his most loyal supporters could not ignore the symbolism. The capital, once seen as an impenetrable fortress, had been struck. For a leader who built his image on stability, order, and control, the visuals of chaos in his own backyard were devastating. The once calm and confident tone of Russian state television gave way to hurried explanations, clipped statements, and visible discomfort. It was a rare moment when the curtain slipped, revealing the uncertainty beneath the surface. Political analysts quickly pointed out that this wasn't just a tactical embarrassment, it was a psychological blow aimed directly at Putin's authority. Every explosion over Moscow was more than a strike on infrastructure, it was a strike on credibility. In a nation where fear and control keep the system intact, perception is everything. And for millions of Russians, seeing their leader fail to protect the very skies above their heads created an invisible crack in that fear, a quiet realization that the man who once promised security may no longer be able to guarantee it. Putin's power structure thrives on the belief that the Russian state is unshakable, but the events of that night revealed just how fragile that foundation can be. Within hours of the attack, the Kremlin's public relations machinery went into overdrive. Officials appeared on television claiming that all drones had been shot down, that damage was minimal, that everything is under control. Yet, as video after video surfaced online, fires, debris, panicked residents, those words lost their weight. Control, the very concept Putin built his regime on, suddenly seemed to be slipping through his fingers. The symbolism couldn't have been more powerful. The man who launched a war to protect Russia was now witnessing that war return home. For years, the Kremlin's propaganda assured citizens that the conflict was distant, confined to Ukrainian soil, and that Russia's strength ensured peace within its borders. That illusion evaporated in one night of explosions. The drones didn't just pierce Moscow's defenses, they pierced the narrative that had kept Putin's grip so firm. When power is built on fear and perception, even a momentary loss of control can shake the entire structure. Behind closed doors, insiders described a sense of quiet panic. Reports suggested that emergency security meetings were convened before dawn, with Putin demanding answers about how the attacks had happened and who was responsible for the failure to stop them. These moments of internal unrest are rarely shown to the public, but whispers emerging from Moscow's corridors of power suggest frustration and unease among senior officials. Some military leaders, already under pressure from earlier battlefield losses, faced renewed scrutiny. The unspoken truth was clear. If Putin cannot protect the capital, how long before loyalty among his own elites begins to waver? The world's perception of Putin also shifted overnight. Once seen as a master of calculated control, he suddenly looked reactive, a leader forced to respond, not dictate. Western intelligence officials noted that the strike exposed not just weaknesses in Russia's defenses, but also fractures in its leadership's composure. The image of Putin, often shown seated confidently behind long tables issuing orders, was replaced by the image of a man scrambling to manage chaos. For a figure who has always equated leadership with dominance, that reversal was profound. The loss of control over Moscow's skies carries a deeper psychological meaning. In Russian history, control of the capital has always symbolized control of the nation. The Kremlin's red walls are not just political, they are symbolic, a monument to centralized authority. The idea that the enemy could reach that sacred space undermines centuries of Russian pride and belief in centralized power. For ordinary citizens, it plants a subtle but dangerous question. If the state cannot protect itself, how can it protect them? As night turned to morning and the smoke over Moscow thinned, Putin's silence spoke volumes. The man who so often used televised addresses to project authority in defiance chose to remain in the shadows, letting subordinates handle the messaging. That decision, perhaps intended to project calm, instead suggested uncertainty. For his opponents abroad and critics at home, it was the clearest sign yet that Putin's control, once thought to be unbreakable, was beginning to erode from within. Across Russia, the emotional impact lingered far longer than the sound of the explosions. It wasn't just fear that gripped people, it was realization. The myth of invincibility, so carefully crafted and reinforced for 2 decades, had been broken by the hum of drones and the fire that followed. And in that silence, as people watched the morning news and scrolled through shaky phone footage, the question no one dared ask out loud began to echo quietly across the country. If Putin cannot control the skies above his own capital, what or who can he truly control anymore? The sound came first, a low, distant rumble that most residents of Moscow dismissed as thunder. Then came the sharp cracks of explosions, shaking windows and setting off car alarms across several districts. Within moments, panic swept through the city. Moscow had long been shielded from the realities of war, was suddenly staring into its own vulnerability. Civilians who had grown used to watching the conflict on screens now found themselves living it. In a country where the government has promised absolute safety, that promise shattered in an instant. What unfolded next was chaos. Sirens pierced the cold night air, their wails echoing through once calm neighborhoods. People rushed out of their apartments, phones in hand, filming glowing trails of drones streaking across the sky and fiery explosions in the distance. Some stood frozen on balconies, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Others ran toward underground shelters, clutching children and documents, a scene that until recently belonged only to Ukraine's war-torn cities. The shock was palpable, raw, and unfolded. Moscow, the heart of Russia, was under attack. On social media, fear spread faster than the drones themselves. Telegram channels flooded with messages. What's happening? Was it real? Should we leave the city? The government's delayed response only fueled the uncertainty. For nearly an hour, there was silence from official sources, leaving the population to fill the void with speculation and dread. When the first official statements arrived, they were vague and defensive, assuring the public that all drones had been destroyed and that no civilian areas were hit, but residents knew what they had seen: flashes in the sky, the crack of detonations, the unmistakable signs of impact. For a population conditioned to believe that Moscow was untouchable, this was a psychological rupture. The city's glittering skyline, once a symbol of power and stability, suddenly felt fragile. Many residents who had previously ignored or supported the war found themselves asking the unspoken question: if this can happen here, what comes next? The illusion that the conflict was distant, confined to the borders of Ukraine, dissolved in a single night. For the first time since the invasion began, Russians felt the same fear their neighbors had endured for nearly 2 years. The panic revealed something deeper than fear. It revealed disillusionment. Ordinary Russians began to see the cracks in the narrative they had been fed. The state's promise of safety, so central to its legitimacy, had been broken. People started calling friends and relatives outside the city, looking for information that didn't come from government channels. The atmosphere inside Moscow was electric with unease. The streets emptied quickly after the strikes. Restaurants closed early, metro stations filled with anxious whispers, and long lines formed at ATMs as rumors of further attacks spread. In the midst of it all, the Russian state television anchors tried to maintain composure. Their carefully measured tones contrasted sharply with the tension visible in their eyes. They assured viewers that the situation was fully under control, that the enemy's attempt had failed. But even through the screen, the performance felt hollow. For the first time, viewers weren't just watching propaganda, they were living its contradiction. The reality outside their windows didn't match the calm being broadcast from inside the studio. International observers noted that this moment could mark a shift in public consciousness within Russia. Fear, once a tool used by the government to control dissent, had turned inward. It was no longer just fear of external enemies or disobedience. It was fear of the unknown, of instability, of the government's inability to protect. The Kremlin had always relied on the idea that chaos existed only beyond its borders. But that night, chaos came home, and it was undeniable. In the following days, the psychological aftershocks lingered. Parents kept children home from school. Businesses quietly reviewed their evacuation plans. Conversations in cafes revolved not around politics or the economy, but around survival. Which part of the city might be safer if it happened again? The tension seeped into daily life, changing the way people looked at the skies. A loud sound, once ignored, now made heads turn. A passing plane brought unease instead of indifference. The once invisible war had become part of Moscow's atmosphere, woven into its very air. For many, the sense of betrayal ran deep. They had believed the state's assurances that Moscow's defenses were impenetrable. They had watched years of military parades showcasing Russia's supposed might. Yet in a single night, the spectacle turned hollow. No parade could erase the memory of the explosions or the fear that crept through apartment corridors. The government's attempts to restore calm through statements, increased police presence, and patriotic messaging only underscored how shaken the city truly was. In a society where speaking openly about fear can be dangerous, silence became its own form of protest. People didn't need to criticize the government. Their expressions, their whispered conversations, their restless movements through the city said enough. The Kremlin could censor news, but it couldn't censor experience. The fear was real, the uncertainty visible, the illusion of control irreparably cracked. That night, Moscow's citizens experienced a collective awakening, not just to the dangers of war, but to the fragility of the narrative they had lived under. The explosions may have stopped, but their echoes continued in every quiet street, every anxious glance, every uneasy silence. For the first time in a generation, the people of Moscow looked at their own government not as a protector, but as a power that had failed to keep the darkness at bay. In the aftermath of the Moscow strikes, while chaos unfolded across the Russian capital, Kyiv's response was strikingly measured, calm, deliberate, and almost silent. There were no loud declarations, no triumphant statements, no dramatic press conferences. Instead, Ukrainian officials maintained a composed and confident tone, offering only subtle hints that the night's events were part of a larger, carefully calculated strategy. This silence spoke louder than any words could. In the theater of modern warfare, where perception often carries as much weight as power, Kiev's quiet confidence became one of its most effective weapons. President Volodymyr Zelensky and his senior aides refused to confirm or deny Ukraine's direct involvement in the Moscow strikes. Their restraint wasn't born from hesitation, it was strategy. By withholding confirmation, Ukraine achieved two objectives. It kept Russia guessing about the extent of its capabilities and maintained plausible deniability on the international stage. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, forcing the Kremlin to confront the possibility that its most protected spaces were no longer safe without giving them the satisfaction of a clear enemy to blame. Behind closed doors, Ukrainian officials reportedly viewed the operation as a pivotal moment in their campaign to push the war back on Russian soil. It wasn't just about physical damage, it was about sending a message to the Kremlin, to Russian citizens, and to the world. Ukraine is not the victim anymore. After months of defending cities under relentless bombardment, Ukraine had shifted the momentum. It was now dictating the tempo of the war, striking not only military targets, but also at the very core of Russia's sense of security. Foreign diplomats and military analysts noticed the shift immediately. Kiev's tone carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes from confidence earned through endurance. While Russia scrambled to explain its failures and reassure a panicked public, Ukraine said almost nothing, and that silence became a statement of strength. Each word withheld added to the Kremlin's unease. Each unanswered question deepened the sense that Ukraine had achieved a level of operational sophistication that Moscow hadn't anticipated. They're not reacting anymore, one Western intelligence officer remarked. They're leading. Inside Russia, this silence had a powerful psychological effect. In a country accustomed to grandiose threats and propaganda, Ukraine's refusal to boast created uncertainty. The Kremlin could not predict what would happen next. The fear of the unknown began to spread faster than any official announcement could contain. Was this a one-time strike? Or the beginning of a campaign where there are more drones waiting to launch. Could Ukraine now reach any city it wanted? The absence of answers kept the entire Russian defense apparatus on edge, and that tension was exactly what Ukraine intended. Kyiv's communication strategy in this phase of the war demonstrated an understanding that modern conflict isn't fought only with missiles and drones, it's fought with information perception and timing. Every move, or lack of one, is a message. The calm from Ukrainian officials contrasted sharply with the frantic statements coming out of Moscow, where Russian state media resorted to deflection and denial. Ukraine simply moved on, allowing global headlines and social media to do the talking. The world saw an aggressor scrambling to explain itself and a defender growing bolder by the day. For the Ukrainian people, this quiet confidence became a source of pride. After enduring months of missile attacks, blackouts, and destruction, they finally saw their nation projecting power, not just in firepower, but in composure. The strikes represented a psychological victory that resonated deeply with a population that had refused to break under constant threat. Kyiv's silence wasn't just tactical. It was emotional, a reflection of a nation that no longer needed to shout to be heard. Western allies, too, took note of Ukraine's shift in posture. Governments in Washington, London, and Brussels analyzed the operation and Ukraine's careful messaging with admiration. This was not a reckless escalation, but a disciplined display of capability. The silence helped maintain diplomatic balance. It denied Russia clear pretext for further escalation, while still signaling that Ukraine had the means and resolve to strike back. It was a rare balance of boldness and restraint that kept Ukraine firmly within the moral high ground of international opinion. Meanwhile, inside the Kremlin, Putin's advisors were left guessing. Intelligence briefings were filled with contradictions, some suggesting Ukraine had used advanced long-range drones, others hinting at internal sabotage. The uncertainty created confusion at the highest levels of Russian command, and confusion breeds fear. Each day that passed without a direct statement from Kyiv deepened that psychological pressure. The enemy was no longer predictable, and unpredictability is the one thing authoritarian systems fear most. Across global news networks, analysts described Kyiv's silence as the sound of confidence. It reflected a government that no longer needed to justify its actions or seek sympathy. Ukraine had earned the right to be feared, respected, and taken seriously. In contrast, Moscow's loud denials and reactive posture made it appear desperate, a power trying to control a story that had already slipped from its grasp. As the dust settled, the image of the night remained etched in the public's mind, explosions lighting up the Moscow skyline, followed by a single quiet statement from Kyiv, one that hinted, not claimed, and promised, not threatened. "We will bring the war home to those who started it," an unnamed Ukrainian official told reporters with a faint smile. It wasn't bravado, it was prophecy. That single sentence encapsulated the new reality of this war, one where Ukraine no longer plays defense but dictates the pace. In that silence, in that controlled restraint, Kyiv proved something far more powerful than firepower. It proved that confidence, precision, and patience can shake empires more effectively than words ever could. The world is watching with growing intensity as cracks begin to show in what was once considered one of the most tightly controlled military powers on Earth. The notion that Russia's air defense system, the very backbone of its homeland security, could be breached not once but repeatedly by a nation fighting for survival is shaking the foundations of Moscow's carefully crafted image of invincibility. Ukraine's recent strikes deep into Russian territory are not just military maneuvers. They are psychological operations designed to humiliate the Kremlin and challenge Vladimir Putin's iron grip. These attacks are symbolic as much as strategic, sending a chilling message across Russia: nowhere is untouchable anymore. For years, Putin's government has boasted about its layered air defense network, from the S-300s to the supposedly impenetrable S-400 systems stationed around key cities. Moscow itself was often portrayed as an impregnable fortress protected by the most advanced radar and missile interceptors on the planet. Yet the sound of explosions near the Kremlin, the sight of smoke rising over Moscow, and the videos circulating on Russian social media tell a very different story. Ukraine's drones and long-range strikes have done what few thought possible. They have pierced the illusion of absolute security. This new phase of warfare marks a dramatic turn. Ukraine is no longer merely defending itself. It is projecting power into the heart of the aggressor's territory. What makes this moment so extraordinary is not just the tactical success of Ukraine's attacks, but the psychological unraveling they have triggered. Inside Russia, citizens who once felt distant from the front lines are now living under the shadow of air raid sirens. Social media platforms that the Kremlin tries to control are flooded with images of burning fuel depots, damaged air bases, and panicked Muscovites filming drones streaking across the night sky. The state-controlled narrative of a special military operation taking place far away is collapsing under the weight of reality. When explosions echo in the capital, it's no longer possible to hide the truth. Putin's myth of control, his projection of dominance and stability, is being rewritten in real time, and it's not by his own hand. For Ukraine, this is a masterstroke in information warfare. Every strike that reaches Russian soil is amplified by the global media, turning battlefield success into political leverage. Each drone that evades Russian defenses is more than a weapon, it's a symbol. It tells Russian citizens that their leadership can't protect them. It tells the world that Ukraine, despite its smaller size and limited resources, has learned to outthink and outmaneuver one of the largest militaries on Earth. In many ways, the battlefield has expanded beyond geography. The war is now about perception, about who controls the story, and for the first time since the invasion began, Ukraine is controlling that story with precision and confidence. Inside the Kremlin, such losses strike at the very core of Putin's authority. His power has always relied on a carefully maintained image of competence, control, and fear. But when the skies above Moscow light up with Ukrainian drones, when his people question the military's capabilities, when even pro-Kremlin commentators start demanding accountability, those foundations begin to tremble. Putin's problem isn't just that Ukraine is attacking him. It's that the attacks are revealing how vulnerable his regime truly is. Each failure to stop a drone, each delayed official response, chips away at the perception of an all-powerful leader who can control everything. This crisis extends beyond military embarrassment. It exposes the hollowness of Russia's massive defense spending and the inefficiency of its bloated bureaucracy. Billions have been poured into fortifying Russian skis, yet the simplest, most cost-effective drones are slipping through. The corruption that has long plagued Russian institutions is now visible for the world to see. And in a country where questioning the state can be dangerous, these failures are sparking quiet conversations, ones that could, over time, turn into something louder. Globally, this shift is also reshaping how nations view Russia. The image of a powerful, technologically advanced state capable of deterring NATO and intimidating its neighbors is fading fast. Instead, Russia appears overstretched, underprepared, and increasingly reactive. Ukraine's ability to strike symbolic targets within Moscow undermines the deterrence that Putin has relied on for decades. It sends a message to allies and adversaries alike: Russia is no longer untouchable. The ripple effects are profound. Within Ukraine, morale is surging. For soldiers on the front lines, knowing that the fight is no longer one-sided fuels determination. For citizens enduring blackouts and bombings, it's a reminder that their resistance has teeth, that even the mightiest enemy can bleed. Meanwhile, in Russia, fear and uncertainty are spreading like wildfire. People are beginning to ask questions that were once unthinkable. If Putin can't even protect Moscow, what else is he failing to control? In the end, the loss of control over the skies above Moscow isn't just a military event. It's a metaphor for Putin's fading grip over his own narrative, his own people, and perhaps his own destiny. The skies that once symbolized his dominance now echo with defiance. And as those drones hum through the dark, one can't help but wonder, has Russia's long proclaimed invulnerability finally come to an end? I'm Anderson Cooper, and this has been CNN's continuing coverage of the escalating conflict in Eastern Europe. We'll continue to follow the fallout from tonight's strikes, the reactions from Moscow and Kiev, and what this means for the future of global security. Stay with us.